Before we start this story, let us know where you're watching this video from. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit that like button. Have a wonderful day. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would orchestrate such an elaborate confrontation. But betrayal has a way of bringing out sides of ourselves we never knew existed. My name is Catherine, and this is the story of how I turned my husband's romantic dinner with his mistress into the most uncomfortable evening of their lives. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I had been married to David for 12 years, and for the past 6 months, something had felt off. He was working late more often. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages he'd quickly dismiss, and he'd started paying more attention to his appearance. The classic signs were all there, but I chose to ignore them because admitting them would mean admitting that the life I'd built was crumbling. David and I had met in college. He was studying business, and I was pursuing my degree in psychology. We were that couple everyone envied, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. We got married right after graduation, bought a house in the suburbs, and settled into what I thought was our happily ever after. David started his own consulting firm, and I worked as a therapist at a local clinic. We talked about having children, but somehow never got around to it. There was always something, a business trip, a new client, a promotion to chase. Looking back now, I realize we had been growing apart for years, but it was such a gradual process that neither of us noticed until we were practically strangers sharing the same bed. Our conversations had become limited to logistics. Who would pick up groceries? Whose turn it was to take the car in for service? What bills needed to be paid? The intimacy had faded so slowly that I barely noticed when it disappeared entirely. But I still loved him, or at least I loved the memory of who we used to be together, which is why discovering his affair felt like having my heart ripped out and stomped on in front of me. The discovery happened by accident, as these things often do. David had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. A message notification popped up on the screen, and without thinking, I glanced over. It was from someone named Rebecca, and the preview text made my blood run cold. "Can't wait for tonight, baby. I've been thinking about you all day." My hands were shaking as I opened his messages. What I found there was months of conversations with this Rebecca person. Intimate messages, photos I never want to think about again, and detailed plans for secret meetings. But what hurt the most were the things he said about me. How I had become boring and predictable. How he felt trapped in our marriage. How being with Rebecca made him feel alive again. I sat there in my kitchen, staring at evidence of my husband's betrayal, and felt something inside me break. But alongside the pain, there was something else growing. A cold, calculating anger that demanded justice. I could have confronted him right then. I could have screamed and cried and thrown his laptop across the room. But my psychology training had taught me that emotional reactions rarely produce the results we want. Instead, I decided to do some investigating. It didn't take long to figure out who Rebecca was. A quick search through David's contacts and social media led me to Rebecca Mitchell, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator at a company David had done consulting work for. She was pretty in that generic way that seems to appeal to middle-aged men going through a crisis. Long blonde hair, perfect makeup, always posing for selfies with pouty lips and strategically placed cleavage. But more importantly, I discovered that Rebecca was married. Her husband's name was James Mitchell, and from what I could gather from his social media profiles, he was a genuinely nice guy. He posted pictures of flowers he'd bought for Rebecca, celebrated her achievements at work, and seemed to adore her completely. He had no idea his wife was sleeping with my husband. That's when the plan began to form in my mind. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully monitoring David's messages with Rebecca. I learned their patterns, their favorite meeting spots, and most importantly, their upcoming plans. They had decided to have a romantic dinner at Chez Laurent, an upscale French restaurant downtown that David and I had been to for our anniversary several years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. The dinner was planned for Friday night at 8 o'clock. David told me he had a business dinner with potential clients and would be home late. I told him I was having a girls' night with my sister and wouldn't wait up for him. We both smiled and kissed goodbye. two people lying effortlessly to each other. But I wasn't done with my preparations. I needed to get James Mitchell involved, and that required a delicate approach. I couldn't just call him up and tell him his wife was cheating. He'd either not believe me or demand proof I wasn't ready to provide. Instead, I created a fake email account and sent him a carefully crafted message. "You don't know me," the email read, "but I thought you should know that someone who looks exactly like your wife has been seen around town with a man who isn't you. They seem very close. I could be wrong, but I thought you deserved to know. A concerned citizen." I included a few photos I'd taken of Rebecca and David together. Nothing explicit, but intimate enough to raise questions. I'd followed them to a coffee shop the previous week and managed to get some pictures of them holding hands and kissing. James responded within hours, asking for more details. I told him I'd seen them together multiple times and that they seemed to be planning something for Friday night. I suggested he might want to do some investigating of his own. The next part of my plan required some social engineering. I called Chez Laurent and spoke to the manager, explaining that I wanted to surprise my husband for our anniversary. I asked if it would be possible to reserve the table next to his reservation under the name David Harper for Friday at 8. The manager was happy to accommodate such a romantic gesture. Friday arrived and I felt surprisingly calm. I had spent the day at a spa, getting my hair done, my nails manicured, and treating myself to a massage. If I was going to confront my cheating husband and his mistress, I was going to look absolutely stunning while doing it. I chose my outfit carefully. A black dress that David had always loved, paired with the diamond necklace he'd given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look like everything Rebecca wasn't, mature, elegant, and completely in control. At 7:30, I was sitting in my car outside James Mitchell's house. I had sent him one final email that afternoon, suggesting he might want to check out Chez Laurent that evening if he was curious about his wife's whereabouts. I included the address and the time of the reservation. James came out of his house at 7:45, looking confused and worried. He got into his car and drove toward downtown. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding with anticipation. I arrived at Chez Laurent first and was seated at my table. The restaurant was dimly lit with soft jazz playing in the background, the perfect setting for romance, or in this case, for revenge. The table next to mine was empty, waiting for David and Rebecca. James arrived a few minutes later. I watched him speak to the hostess, looking around the restaurant nervously. He was a handsome man in his early 30s with kind eyes and an honest face. My heart went out to him. He was about to have his world shattered just like I had. I got up and approached him. "Excuse me," I said softly. "Are you James Mitchell?" He looked surprised. "Yes, do I know you?" "I'm Catherine Harper," I said, extending my hand. "I think we need to talk." The recognition dawned on his face immediately. "You're the one who sent me those emails." "I am, and I'm also the wife of the man your wife is having an affair with." James stared at me for a long moment, processing this information. "So it's true," he said quietly. "I'm afraid so. They should be here any minute. I've reserved the table right next to theirs. Would you like to join me?" He looked around the restaurant, then back at me. "This is insane." "Yes, it is. But sometimes insane situations call for insane solutions." James hesitated for another moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's do this." We were seated just as David and Rebecca walked into the restaurant. They were laughing about something, completely oblivious to what was waiting for them. David had his hand on the small of Rebecca's back, a gesture that had once been reserved for me. Rebecca was wearing a red dress that was probably more expensive than my monthly grocery budget. They were led to their table, which was indeed right next to ours. David had his back to me, but Rebecca was facing our direction. I watched her face carefully, waiting for the moment of recognition. It happened about 5 minutes after they sat down. Rebecca glanced over at our table, and I saw her eyes widen in shock. She grabbed David's arm and whispered something urgently in his ear. David turned around, and the color drained from his face when he saw me. But the real shock came when he noticed James sitting across from me. "Oh my God," Rebecca whispered, loud enough for us to hear. James raised his wine glass in a mock toast. "Hello, darling," he said to his wife. Fancy meeting you here. David looked like he was going to be sick. Catherine, I can explain. Oh, I'm sure you can, I said calmly, not bothering to lower my voice. But first, let me introduce you to James Mitchell. James, this is my husband David. David, this is Rebecca's husband James. The silence that followed was deafening. Other diners were starting to notice the tension at our tables. Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Perhaps, I continued, we should discuss this like civilized adults. James and I have been having a lovely conversation about trust and marriage, haven't we, James? James nodded, playing along perfectly. We have indeed. Catherine was just telling me how important honesty is in a relationship. David was frantically trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Look, this isn't what it looks like. It looks like you're having a romantic dinner with another man's wife, I said, which is exactly what it is. Rebecca finally found her voice. James, I can explain everything. Can you? James asked quietly. Can you explain why you told me you were working late tonight? Can you explain these photos? He pulled out his phone and showed her the pictures I had sent him. The conversation that followed was painful to watch, even though I had orchestrated it. Rebecca broke down crying, admitting to the affair and begging James for forgiveness. David tried to minimize what had happened, claiming it was just a mistake and that he still loved me. But I was done with his lies. I had heard enough in his messages to Rebecca to know that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated betrayal that had been going on for months. David, I said, interrupting his stammered apologies. I've read your messages, all of them. I know exactly how you feel about me, about our marriage, and about her. So please, don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was just a moment of weakness. He stared at me, realizing that his secret was completely exposed. How did you? It doesn't matter how. What matters is that it's over. All of it. I stood up from the table, and James followed my lead. We had accomplished what we came to do. David and Rebecca sat there looking devastated. Their romantic evening turned into a public humiliation. James, I said, would you like to continue our dinner somewhere else? I find the company here rather unpleasant. He smiled for the first time that evening. I'd like that very much. We walked out of Chez Laurent together, leaving David and Rebecca to deal with the wreckage of their deception. I could feel the stares of other diners as we passed, but I held my head high. I had nothing to be ashamed of. James and I ended up at a quiet diner down the street, where we talked for hours about our marriages, our disappointments, and our plans for the future. He was going through the same emotional turmoil I was, but there was something comforting about sharing that experience with someone who truly understood. We didn't become romantically involved. We were both too raw and too focused on rebuilding our lives, but we became friends, supporting each other through the difficult months that followed. David tried to come home that night, but I had already changed the locks. I left his clothes on the front porch along with a note telling him to find somewhere else to stay. He called and texted constantly, alternating between anger and desperation, but I didn't respond. My lawyer handled all communication from that point forward. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. David had to sell his business to pay the settlement, and he lost most of his clients when word got out about his behavior. Apparently, trust is important in the consulting business, and clients don't want to work with someone who can't even be trusted by his own wife. Rebecca and James divorced as well, though their process was much more acrimonious than mine. She tried to claim that I had manipulated the situation and that she was the real victim. But James had seen enough evidence to know exactly who she was, and he wasn't interested in her excuses. Looking back on that evening at Chez Laurent, I sometimes wonder if I should feel guilty about the way I handled things. It was certainly dramatic, and it caused pain for everyone involved. But then I remember all the nights I waited up for David, all the lies he told me, and all the ways he made me feel like I wasn't enough. I don't regret exposing the truth. I regret that it had to be exposed at all. The experience taught me that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. For years, I had defined myself in relation to David, as his wife, his partner, his support system. But when that relationship ended, I discovered that I was still me. I was still Catherine, and I was still worth more than being someone's second choice. I've rebuilt my life completely. I moved to a new city, started my own therapy practice, and learned to enjoy my own company. I've gone on dates, but I'm not in a rush to remarry. I'm finally comfortable being alone, which is something I never thought I'd be able to say. James and I still keep in touch. He's doing well, focusing on his career and spending time with his family. We joke sometimes about our dinner date and how we turned the tables on our cheating spouses. It's become a story we tell with pride rather than pain. The night we refused to be victims and took control of our own narratives. David still reaches out occasionally, usually when he's had too much to drink. He tells me he's sorry, that he made a mistake, that he wants to try again. But I've learned that apologies without changed behavior are just words, and I've heard enough of his words to last a lifetime. Rebecca moved to another state shortly after their divorce. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she's engaged to someone new. I hope for his sake that she's learned something from her experience, but I suspect she's just found a new person to deceive. The most important thing I learned from that entire experience is that betrayal says nothing about the person being betrayed and everything about the person doing the betraying. I spent months wondering what I had done wrong, how I had failed as a wife, why I wasn't enough to keep David faithful. But the truth is that his infidelity was about his own character flaws, not about my shortcomings. I also learned that revenge, when executed properly, isn't about causing pain. It's about revealing truth. I didn't set out to hurt David and Rebecca. I set out to expose their deception and force them to face the consequences of their actions. The pain they felt was a natural result of their own choices, not something I inflicted on them. That night at Chez Laurent wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. It was the night I stopped being a victim and started being the author of my own life. It was the night I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone else's bad behavior define your worth. And sometimes the best revenge is making sure that everyone knows exactly who they're dealing with. If you're going through something similar, remember this: you are not responsible for other people's choices, but you are responsible for your own response to those choices. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to be a survivor. You can choose to hide from the truth, or you can choose to face it head on. I chose to face it head on, and I've never regretted that decision. The truth, as uncomfortable as it can be, really will set you free. And sometimes, it will also set you up for the most satisfying dinner conversation of your life.